Well, good afternoon. I'm Robert Kelly. I'm one of the pastors here at the church. What'd you come up with as to why we keep it so cold? It's to keep the communion cold. No, actually, don't worry. The heat will be back next week. That's all you need to worry about, I guess, for that. So we are here at the end of our Surviving Christmas series. It's that awkward week for us between Christmas and New Year's. Don't really want to start a new series until the new year, but it feels weird, of course, because we're kind of at the end of Christmas. So how do we survive Christmas? I guess the real question is, did you survive Christmas? Yeah? But it's the 12 o'clock service. That doesn't tell me that much. Now, the 9 o'clock service, I knew they had made it, although it didn't look like many of them. They looked like they were more shells. But yeah, we did make it, right? We made it. Some maybe no worse for wear, and others maybe not quite as well as maybe we'd hope we would. You know, this is a kind of a nice time for us to pause and to reflect. We get to look back a little bit on 2012, and we get to finish out what it is we began in the first week of December. We were looking at these Beatitudes, the way toward the blessed life. And when we started looking at each of these Beatitudes, we started to find that they didn't make the intuitive sense that we'd hoped they would. When you start to look at how God tells us that we get the blessed life, it seems so counterintuitive, even extreme. And we're coming up against one of the most extreme of those this morning. Yet, in another way, it makes perfect sense when you think about the Christmas story. And I'm not the Christmas story that makes it on the front of our Christmas cards or into a lot of our favorite movies. I'm talking about the Christmas as you read it in the Scriptures, the one that is filled with incredible hope and heartache. We're talking about the one that promises the Messiah, and yet it's filled with misery, suffering. We have a child who's escaping, a king who's trying to kill him, and a village left in ruins behind. The story of Christmas, as told in the Bible, is one of incredible intensity, high highs and low lows, and a bittersweet storyline. And then we come to our blessed life, and we find these extremes as well. In fact, it mirrors even our year, because 2012 feels to me like the year where extremes became normal, where we just sort of had to start to come to grips with maybe a world that will not be quite so predictable, maybe a world in which there will be some very great successes and some very bitter defeats, and a lot of anguish and suffering to go with them. So we come to the blessed life, and we start to ask this question: how is it that the Christmas story, which starts with such diversity of storyline, leads to a blessed life that is filled with such diversity of storyline as we looked at over the last few weeks, and yet it makes perfect sense again, because Jesus himself was one of these kinds of figures. I mean, he came and he forced a decision to be made about him. Each and every person who comes into contact with Jesus they were forced to confront who they really were and how or if they would ever trust and depend upon Christ. They were forced with these decisions. You will pick him or something else. And he did this over and over and over throughout his life. It isn't really a surprise then that as we come to the Beatitudes that we find some of these teachings, like being poor in spirit and mourning and meekness and hungering for righteousness. These things don't surprise us as much. We come to expect them even as we get to know the life of Christ. Yet we come to this last one in Matthew chapter 5, verse 10. And you can open up into Matthew chapter 5. We're going to be staying within a couple chapters of Matthew 5 for the remainder of the morning. And we find this beatitude. Remember, these are the pathways to the blessed life. Matthew 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom. Well, that's good news. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Look what he says in verse 11. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad. Merry Christmas. There you go. There's the pathway to the blessed life. You're going to see persecution. Actually, I think he even goes a step beyond that. I think he says persecution becomes the litmus test. I think without persecution, we are running a great risk that we're not on the path for the blessed life. Think about this for a moment. He gets to the end of these Beatitudes, and the end of them, they're just a series of blessings, and you can see each one, verse 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It all starts in the same formula. Blessed are those, blessed are, blessed are, blessed are, blessed are. 10 ends the Beatitudes proper. That's the end of the little segment, the little literary unit he's created here. But he doesn't want to let go of this idea of persecution. He picks it up again in verse 11. This is a different format, though. He's not saying, blessed are those. He says, blessed are you. You're the blessed one. Now he's going to bring this home. He's going to make this personal. It's easy to think of persecution as it has taken place throughout the world for 2,000 years. Christians have been dying for their faith as martyrs all over the world and still do today. From oppressive governments or rival faith groups, whatever it is, Christians are still experiencing persecution. But he's going beyond this. He's talking about a persecution that can take place that isn't simply the kind that the early church would soon see. He's saying they're going to insult you. They're going to falsely say all kinds of evil against you. And when that happens, rejoice and be glad. Now, how much rejoicing and being glad have you been able to have in your journey because of Christ? How much? Have you gotten to this place in your journey where you've noticed that your family is sort of done with you? They're sick of this whole Jesus thing that you're all wrapped up in now. Or maybe your circle of friends is saying, you used to be fun. Now you're a dud, so we really don't want to hang out so much. They probably wouldn't say that, of course, would they? They would just stop calling. And you've got coworkers who are, doing their little thing and taking advantage of their company, and you're stepping out of it, and you're saying, you know what? This isn't right. That's stealing. I'm not going to do this. And so your coworkers are now looking at you as this harsh or foolish kind of a person who doesn't really understand the way the world really works. Maybe you've got this group of folks that you have pulled back from because they were taking you in all of the wrong directions in your life. Maybe instead you've got some of these habits that you're now giving up because it's not who you want to be. Have you begun to experience the persecution or the insults? Because if you haven't, do we have to ask whether or not we are on this path? If our lives have been such that we don't experience any of this, why is it that Jesus assured us we would? Have we missed something? He says that it is because of righteousness, and I like that. If you notice there at the end of verse 10, he says, or in the middle, he says, those who are persecuted because of righteousness. And I think that's a key qualifier here. In a moment, when he expands it, he'll say, because of me. They're synonymous for him. Whether it's because of righteousness or it's because of him, it helps us understand the persecution. I think this is a really important thing because in America, it seems, we can easily be persecuted for what we think is Christianity but really isn't. We can be persecuted for a whole variety of means, but it isn't really persecution because of righteousness or because of Christ. It's persecution because we've made some boneheaded decisions. And that's not what he's talking about here. There was a guy that he and his wife were out shopping at a giant mall. And they lost track of each other, and they kind of went their separate ways. And now it was time for them to kind of meet up again. So the wife calls and says, hey, where are you? And the husband, he says, well, do you know that jewelry store in the mall? And she says, no. He says, the one that we went into a long time ago, and you saw this beautiful ring and bracelet that I said we couldn't afford. You remember that jewelry store? She's like, yeah, I remember that store. And he says, well, I'm in the bar next to it. Now, when he gets persecuted, it's because he deserves it. And sometimes Christians, we get this idea that we're being persecuted for our faith because we have been harsh or unloving or judgmental. That has nothing to do with being persecuted for righteousness' sake. That's not being persecuted. That just means that you happen to be a follower of Christ, or you claim to follow Christ, and you've done some stupid things in life. That's not persecution for righteousness' sake. There's a huge distinction. You've got some extreme political views, and people around you are mocking you because of your extreme political views. If they're not rooted in the life of Christ, they're your views. And you're being persecuted for those. That's not you being persecuted for Christ. That's not what this is talking about. You're just being persecuted like anyone else who's making foolish decisions. I have done so many things that I wish I could have put in the persecuted for Christ category, but I really know I'm being persecuted or I'm being insulted or mocked because I have fully deserved it, because I have brought it on myself. That's not what this is really talking about in any way. I like the qualification he gives us, because what he's really talking about, this idea of being persecuted for righteousness, it's about those who suffer because we are determined to live our lives like Christ. The pathway has to start at the beginning of the Beatitudes, with all of the poverty of spirit and the meekness that we've already spoken about, the quickness to forgive and to grant mercy. You have to live that kind of life and then understand what it means to follow Christ in the more difficult situations. Those are the moments when we begin to experience what persecution for the sake of righteousness is all about. And again, as we'll see here in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is telling us that we have to choose the more difficult one. We have to pick the harder way, the way of Christ. He'll give us here a few different ones. He'll say there are two choices, two paths, two voices, two trees, two houses, two builders, the whole thing. You'll see that there's going to be a choice that each of us will be confronted with. Open up, if you flip over a few pages to Matthew chapter 7, you'll see as he's coming toward the end of this great segment of teaching, chapter 7, verse 13, he says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." He's saying you've got to pick. You've got to choose the narrow road, the one that the crowds won't be on, the lonelier of the two, the harder of the two. That's the gate and the road that you've got to pick. So, what are your favorite vegetables? Favorite vegetables. See, it takes us a while to think through this. What are they? Asparagus. Brussels sprouts. Spinach. See, every time one of you over here says Brussels sprouts, someone over there goes, "Ah, come on, really? Brussels? Are you kidding me?" Yeah, when they're like baked when they have bacon and breadcrumbs or something, maybe. Because then, if you put your vegetables in the hands of a super competent chef, they become tolerable for us. So if this is the case, why do you eat vegetables? Because they're good for you. And we know this to be true because in 2012 they did a study on last meals. Death row. Last meals. They found out what these guys who are really having their last meal, what they ask for. Can you imagine how many ask for vegetables? Would you? I mean, come on. We just simply wouldn't. Average meal, 7,200 calories, by the way. All of the best of the fried foods and all of this kind of stuff. We will tolerate our vegetables because they promise us something in the future. I have not yet heard a doctor, I wish there was just one, who would come out and say, "Listen, the big problem in America right now is you guys need to eat more comfort food. You got to load up, man. Chicken pot pie, mac and cheese. You know those egg sandwiches from the deli? Bacon, egg, cheese, salt, pepper, ketchup on a buttered roll. Oh, come on. That thing is awesome. We can't just one doctor come out and say, please, you guys eat more of those things. No, they're always saying the same thing. You got to eat the vegetables. Because if you do, if you make a harder decision now, it will result in good things in the future. A bit of delayed gratification. And it's compelling enough because they tell us that if we don't, then we die earlier and more painful. And so suddenly we're like, oh, all right, let's go back to the vegetable thing and try to figure out how to make vegetables tolerable, because the whole, death by painful means soon isn't really a compelling option for us. So we're willing to make significant changes now in order not to see this. We've chosen the narrow road and the smaller gate. Not simply whatever it is we wanted to do at a moment, but we've picked something more difficult and more challenging. He tells us here that this is going to be a lonelier road. And we think it's not hard to imagine why. But this part of his teaching becomes exceedingly controversial. If it weren't here in the scriptures, we would never even want to talk like this. Think about it. The mass of humanity isn't on that road. It's a narrow one. There will be fewer people there. It's a smaller gate. Jesus comes out punching. He says, not all roads lead to God. In fact, the broader roads, where most will be, don't. It leads to destruction. These are difficult teachings that he puts in front of us. Of course, this makes it a lonely road in and of itself. Just having that out there in front of us makes it a lonely road, because we live in a day and age where society despises the intolerance of such a message and will quickly persecute any who make a claim as exclusive as the one that Jesus made. But he's not done. Look at verse 15. He says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them. He says, you've got to choose whether you will listen to the true or the false messages. The full gospel that I'm presenting, or some partial version of it. In a moment, you'll see he even talks about people who make claims about Christ himself. They talk about, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? He says to them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. See, apparently not even claiming the name of Christ is sufficient to guarantee that you are listening to those who tell truth rather than lies. This is also a difficult topic. We know that there's all sorts of falsehood and fraud all around us. 2012, Americans saw a record $40 to $50 billion in fraud. So most of us have had some type of fraud that has taken advantage of us. That's just the illegal stuff. I can't imagine if you found all the legal loophole stuff that most of us would consider fraud. I can't even imagine how big that number would be. We're used to living in a culture where there's all of these competing kinds of voices, and some are easier to see than others. One of my favorite is the Onion. You guys, anybody have any favorite articles from the Onion? You guys know the Onion, right? It's a satirical newspaper, online newspaper. Well, the Onion makes up everything. Nothing is true in it. And this was a headline this year. Gallup poll: rural whites prefer the president of Iran to the president of the United States. Which, of course, we look at it and we're like, that is funny, because there's just so many things wrong with that. It's just so possibly not, it can't possibly, rural whites of all people, really? Like, someone hasn't done their demographics. We find this sort of a thing funny. A news agency in Iran, they thought it was real news. They saw Gallup, they saw it printed online, and they picked it up and covered it as if it was a real study, which makes it even funnier. Because now, of course, you've got a real news agency in another country promoting this. So they were called out on it. And they said, guys, read the rest of the Onion. Like, it's just wrong in so many ways. It's just a joke. And you fell for it. And they came back and they actually apologized. They said, you're right. We promoted it like it was real news. However, we think it is true. Like, what? Come on. It isn't true. It was lies and you bought it. And this can happen to any of us, not hopefully this easily, but it does happen to us. You will come across an idea or a teaching, or there will be a speaker, someone who will have the charisma to draw you in, or they'll have some information that resonates with your heart. Doesn't matter. We've got to go back to the scriptures to find out whether these things are true or false. See, I think for each of us, it's very easy for us to forget the other parts of his message. Any message that comes to us without the narrow gate emphasis can't be the full message. We know in Christian circles, they're really, you might think of it as a little bit of a paradox even. There's a challenge at the center of Christianity. And often when there's false teaching, it's because we have erred on one side of this continuum. The one side is that we are saved by grace through faith. And that is true. There is no amount of obedience that you can bring to your Christian walk that will make God look favorably on your life. That's what the cross is about. Now, for some of you, this is brand new news. You've never actually heard that forgiveness comes only through the cross of Christ. But that's what the Bible teaches us. You cannot earn your salvation. You can't work hard enough and have God say to you, oh, hey, great, you did so good. You're nearly perfect. You're in. God doesn't say that. He looks to us and he says, you've rebelled against me. And the only way back to me is through the death, the sacrifice of Christ. If you take his righteousness for yourself, then you can now approach God. That's key. Much of false teaching will not emphasize this part of the gospel message. They will tell you time and again that if you do our 5 pillars, if you obey in these certain ways, if your behavior conforms in this certain manner, if you work really, really hard and you give, then maybe, just maybe, God will like you. It's not the gospel message. Our value has been determined at the cross. That being said, just like there is no amount of obedience in which you can enter the kingdom of heaven, we also have to look at the other side of this. Because without obedience, you will also not enter the kingdom of heaven. So how does this work? The human heart, when it rests before God, when we trust in the work of Christ, is renewed. It's given new life. The Spirit is born in you. And that Spirit begins the work of transformation. That work of transformation will bring about a change of life. So we have people who say, yes, I've decided to commit my life to Christ, but they never go any further. Then I have to question, and it seems like the scriptures question, whether or not that's a life that has ever genuinely been transformed. Now we're on the other side of this thing, and we're saying, why is it that there's so much emphasis on the way we live? Because the heart work is already being done by the Spirit. It's a natural result now. If you don't have an increasing obedience in your life, you've got to stop and ask, what happened? How come it didn't work for me? How come there's something not going on? Is there a part of your life? Is there a resistance to the moving of the Spirit? What's going on? This isn't the kind of Christianity that the scriptures tell us about. You see, often if we're going to be following false teaching, it revolves around this idea, an error on one of the sides of this conversation. We see it again in verse 24. He says, therefore, chapter 7, 24, he says, therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house. And yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. I think for many of us, if you've been around in the Christian world for any length of time, for those of you who these are totally new metaphors, you will actually be able to read this easier than Christians who have been studying the Bible for some years. Here's why I think this happens to us. We understand that throughout the Bible, Jesus is referred to as the rock, right? So he's the foundation stone. He's the rock that causes people to stumble. So when we hear rock and sand, we immediately fill in the rest of the picture. And we say, you need to build your house on Jesus. He's the rock. So build your house on Jesus. And so in some vague and undefined way, we talk about this thing without much description as to what it looks like. We just say, you got to build your house on Jesus. And so we say, well, I believe in Jesus, therefore I'm building my house on Jesus. But that isn't really what this passage is saying, is it? He says, verse 25, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But here's the counter to it, the sand. But everyone who hears these words of mine, see that? But everyone who hears these words, meaning what he's just been teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, starting with the Beatitudes, who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Well, then you can work backward from there. You can say, all right, if I've heard these words and not put them into practice, I've built them on the sand, which means who's building on the rock? The one who hears these things and puts them into practice. The emphasis is on obedience. It's not simply saying in some esoteric way that you got to trust in Christ. It's going further than that. He's saying you've got to actually do everything that's been said. Obedience is the natural and normal, though difficult, call for the follower of Christ if you want the blessed life. Now, researchers, Journal of Consumer Research, they did an examination of people who were trying to resist temptation. So they had this group of people here who were told in their self-talk to say, I can't. And then they had a group over here to say, I don't. This seems like a subtle enough shift. So what does this mean? This group is deciding not to eat that thing, do that thing, go that place, say those things. And they say, I can't. I can't do those things. Which is really almost a cry of deprivation. I can't do it. I want to, but I can't. I really would like it, but I can't do those things. Someone's taking it away from me. The researchers say those who wanted to resist temptation, they were better served by saying, I don't. Because now, this isn't about deprivation, it's about empowerment. It's about a decision that a person makes. I think this is what Jesus is calling us to. He's saying, don't play this game of I can't. I'm calling you to make a decision. How will you live? This way or that? If you say I can't, then you're a victim. If you say I don't do these things, I won't do these things. Because these are the kinds of things that draw me away from my Lord and Savior. These are the kinds of things that draw me closer. I will do these. He's calling us to make this kind of a decision. He gives us these two ways. One that is marked by obedience, the other marked by disobedience. And the Sermon on the Mount, it ends. This was the very last part of the Sermon on the Mount, most famous teaching that Jesus ever gave. And he ends it not with some sort of platitudes about humanity drifting off and all things working out and all things becoming good. That's the way we would have ended it. He doesn't end it like that at all. He ends it with a series of very stark decisions. There is one way that will lead to destruction, bad fruit, fire, exclusion, ruin. The way that you would call the path of the curse. You rest under the curse. Starting from the very beginning of the Bible, we see that curse show up from the story in Genesis all the way through. That's where it ends. On the other, leads to life, to good fruit, to entrance into God's kingdom, to stability, to blessing, to the blessed life. Now, it's at a moment like this that some people will sort of cringe because you see what I'm doing. It feels like I'm doing that old preacher trick. Fire, brimstone, hell, destruction, and over here, life and all good things like heaven. This is what he does. You've got to come to grips with this. This is how Jesus chose to end, because he knows that some people will be drawn because of grace and mercy and forgiveness, and he knows that other people need to be awoken from their slumber. He says there is only two ways, and every decision you make will put you on a path, one toward life and one towards death. And if you put this into the real world, we would not have nearly so many problems with it. If you got home today and the house across the street, you saw smoke billowing, out the back of the house, and you knew it was on fire, and you saw their cars out front, and you figured your neighbors were there, all 5 of them were in that house, and you ran over there and you started banging on that door, and you wake them up from their Sunday afternoon nap. You're right, you startled them, you scared them. They were suddenly awoken to the need and the despair and the risk. You would not in any way feel bad about that moment. In fact, they wouldn't come running out of the house and say, "How dare you? How dare you come over here and startle me and try to scare me?" I think Jesus understands. I think he is genuinely pleading with us. He's saying, "I'm just telling you the way it is. I'm banging on your door and I'm trying to awake you from your slumber because you don't understand the stakes like I do. You don't understand what the eternal ramifications are for how we live today, for which road we choose." So he calls us to pick the harder way, the one marked with the laying down of our lives and conformity to all of the teachings that he's presented to us. And it takes boldness and it takes courage. And it results in a society and in a group that will, of course, persecute us. Will turn and say, "Why? How can you possibly?" And yet, he doesn't hesitate. He calls us to it without shame. May we live in that same way. Would you guys pray with me? Lord, we're asking that at the end of 2012, as we begin to think about our next year and who we will be and how we will live and what will be important to us, I pray that you would awaken us to this stark reality and decision. Will we put you at the center, or will we go our own way? We're making again the same decision that was made in the garden by Adam and by Eve. To put you first or ourselves. To do it your way or ours. To submit ourselves or to beat our own path. You've laid out for us, Lord, the consequences as one who assures us that you know more and better than we do, that you see more clearly, that you understand these things in a way that we couldn't. And you're asking for us to trust you. I pray that more and more of us here would do just that. And that this next year would be marked by lives of surrender, sold out to you. That we would take you at your word, that we would delay our gratification in obedience to you. That we would abandon the path that leads to death and journey in the path that leads to life. We ask all of this in Christ's name. Amen.